finish a little before 1 so we can just kind of engage in some conversation. And that way I'm not the only one standing up here talking. So she gave a little bit of my resume and kind of how I ended up here, but let me go a little further back and just say that I think you always have to figure out what it is that you are really passionate about and what motivates you. And very early on, I decided and found that I liked the law and I liked policy things. I grew up and had most of my, I guess if you want to call it leadership training or experience when I was in high school and middle school in the NAACP. And so being involved in that at such a young age, I was maybe 11 or 12 and then continued on. And then even when I got here at U of L, was continually active in the college chapter for the NAACP here. And I held a bunch of different offices. It just had been, that was what was passionate for me. Civil rights, working for equality, making opportunities accessible to everyone. That was where I, got my joy. And so that's what I decided to do. Initially, I thought I was going to be like a history teacher. My mom was a history teacher. I was like, if I get to do world history or civil rights and get to talk about it in that sense, that would be what I would want. But I ended up taking a like a business law class when I was in high school, and I went to manual. And I was like, oh, this is it right here for me. And so after, and I always liked government. I interned all through high school at what was then the Board of Aldermen. And so that really, for me, solidified some things because at that time, I got to work on a lot of good things, even though I worked for, I don't want to offend any Republicans, but I worked for a Republican alderwoman at the time. But I got to work on a fairness ordinance and a lot of other really interesting things and do legal research and things of that nature. And I wasn't, I was still in high school. So that kind of really sparked my interest in government, and as opposed to just law. And so I figured at that point I want to do something that's going to mix my interests. And so right after law school, actually, sometimes it's hard to find a job. I ended up working at a firm in Cincinnati. I worked at a bond firm, and that's all they did. Specialty boutique firm, they did municipal bonds. So other really good experiences in that sense is that I got to work on huge deals throughout the summer that I interned there in my second year and part of my first year. And so I got to work on deals around the Red Stadium. I did that one. I got to work on deals for the Bengals Stadium, lots of hospital bonds and general obligation bonds and that sort of thing. And the reason why I ended up at that firm at the time was because in Cincinnati back in the late 90s, they were having diversity and inclusion issues. Not that many African American attorneys in the city at firms. And so there was a huge push and recruitment area for them to increase that number. At the firm that I was at the time, there was only one other woman and one other African American male attorney who was a partner, and then me. And so that was always a really good experience because at the time, all of us that were first year associates in the city would get together every month and kind of, sometimes you're commiserating, sometimes you're, really just networking with each other and trying to figure out what else is going on and where else you can fit in, particularly being new to the city and that sort of thing. I changed life paths at the time, got married, moved back to Louisville. And with that, I had connections from when I interned and got in touch with individuals at the city of Louisville and ended up being the affirmative action specialist. But before that, I was a public defender because I thought I wanted to get some trial experience and figure that out, because the whole year that I'd been in Cincinnati, I was in office. I was doing research, I'm checking documents, I'm doing other things of that nature, which municipal bonds is very detailed, even though I got to work on a lot of good deals. But I felt like I needed to vary my experience, so, and really found out that firms are not really for me. That didn't work all that well. It wasn't like I was gonna come back and try to bill hours, and I just didn't, it didn't sit well with me. And so I ended up at the public defender's office. I was supposed to be in the juvenile division, but at the time, because PDs are so well paid, half of them left all at one time. So that was like 17 attorneys that left the adult division all at one time. And when I started, they were like, no, we need people in adult division, you're not in juvenile. And I was like, time out. That's not what I was hired for, that's not my heart. But it really ended up being a really good experience. I worked arraignment court, did child support court, did probation and parole, and a couple of jury trials. And really, when you're in the system like that and realizing that it's a lot of work. I would have, I don't know, about 12 or 15 clients in the morning, and another 12 or 15 in the afternoon. And then you go see all of your clients that are in the jail in the evening after court. And so, and you do that for about $25,000. So it was long days and absolutely stressful when you're holding someone's life and liberty in your hands in that way. But I definitely learned a lot. My husband at the time was basically like, you need to make some more money, this is ridiculous. Like, you might be learning some things, but we broke. So that's when I went ahead and moved to the city and became the affirmative action specialist. So this was right before merger with the city. And so at the time, the mayor was Dave Armstrong, and he was an excellent mentor, excellent mayor to work for. He'd been in politics for a while, but I always say that he was not a politician because he was always so very committed to doing the right thing. And I was super young, and he decided that at that point I would become the director of affirmative action after about 6 months or so. I've written the city's affirmative action plan, I've written our ADA 504 plan, I did all the Title VI investigations for the city, and he had pulled that out of HR and out of the legal department purposely because he wanted to make sure that those things were elevated. Also at the time, worked on the ordinance around contracting and procurement, and our minority woman disabled owned goes at the time. So worked a lot with the Human Relations Commission, so that when the director of the Human Relations Commission right before merger decided that she was going to retire, he was like, well, just go ahead and go over there. So granted, I had no supervisory experience. I was in my mid-20s, and now I have a staff of about 40 people. So, but they were all just very equally committed to the mission of the Human Relations Commission, and it just made it very easy to jump in, even though they were all, of course, older than me, and didn't really know what I was going to say or do to them at the time. And then at merger, it was interesting because the Human Relations Commission at the time was a joint city-county agency. So we enforced the employment, housing, public accommodations, and hate crimes at that time, depending upon where you lived or where you were complaining about. So there were the county ordinances that the commission enforced, and then the city ordinances that they enforced. And so it was very welcoming for us that merger came, and we only had one set of ordinances that we would have to follow at that time. And so we also had to, at merger, make sure that anything that had been enacted needed to be reenacted, such as fairness. So got to work on it for a second time, and it was really good. Wasn't much pushback, I believe, at the time around it, but there was a lot of education around the council at that point because there were 26 people and half of them were new at the time. And so we spent a lot of time doing a lot of education and a lot of outreach. And I stayed there after merger working for Mayor Abramson till about 2005, 2006. And then I had met people and worked through projects, federal highway projects, through the commission and through my work with minority and women-owned businesses. At that time, they were looking for someone at the beginning of the Beshear administration to kind of take on that office. At the time, that office had been involved in an audit and investigation around transportation dollars and that sort of thing. And I was also, really honestly, I was bored. I'd been at the commission for about 6 years and was really looking to do something else and wanted to figure out what I wanted to do. At the time, I thought it might be, employment law, but I said, I'm firm averse. So I was like, where can I get to do this? So when I got the call from someone that was going to be working in Governor Beshear's new administration, I was like, oh, well, maybe I'll do, I'll do HR. I'll do their personnel management office. So I ended up doing both. I was director of both offices, moved all my staff into one location when I got up to Frankfort. And that was also an interesting time for their personnel management department because there were people there right after the Fletcher administration who had been involved in whistleblower lawsuits and some of the other highway contracting scandal that was going on at the time. I always say that was probably one of the most interesting days of my life, that very first day, because on that first day I had to meet with the Inspector General, who was investigating people still within the department. I had to meet with the FBI because one of the employees at Transportation Cabinet was selling drugs out his truck. And then I had to go around and also let people know that it was their last day as political appointees. So it's a long drive for me coming back to Louisville because I was commuting back and forth. But it got better from there, I will say, but I definitely, I definitely learned a lot. That was my first time telling people, that this is not your job anymore. And of course, when you think about this, an interesting twist, so the employee that was he was a bridge inspector in one of the further eastern counties and had been watching him for a while and instead of going to inspect bridges, he was selling pills and other things out of the KYTC truck. So I'm like, well, what are you here with me for? Like, just go get him. And so he'd been a long time employee, I believe, with the cabinet. And so you think you get arrested and indicted, that would mean you would no longer have your job. I was wrong. At the state, all employee rights are governed by a statute called ATA. And so when he appealed his termination, they said that I was wrong. I should have suspended him. And so he would serve this, I don't know, I guess when he gets out. Was our joke about that. But they have quite a bit of rights under 18A, like obviously more than what most people would normally think of when they come to mind. So at the time, I worked for Secretary Joe Prather, and we were working on the Bridges project in addition to doing a massive reorganization of the cabinet, staff-wise and personnel-wise, and trying to figure that out. I will say personally, I've dealt with discrimination, racist comments, all that good stuff over, you get a little bit at the firm because, you're young and people don't really know, but at the cabinet, because I was still young, most younger than us, you're dealing with a lot of engineers, and the cabinet had overall across the state about 5,000 or so employees. So if I'm talking to someone on the phone, a lot of times they don't realize who they were talking to until they came in, and they was like, oh, that was you? Well, honey, little girl, anything else you could think of would come out, and I'd be like, well, you know, this would be the one that would, you know, help sign your payroll. So you might not want to continue to talk about me in that manner. But it was a very interesting place to work. As they always say, sometimes you might hear about the transportation cabinet, that it is the fourth leg of government, and that's true. It's completely different from the other cabinets. It's very, you know, because so much money flows through there, and because of just the situation and the reign that all that money will have within the state, it is a different entity. And when you're coming in trying to clean up something from fraud and abuse and unethical behavior, you're not looked at, and you're not always looked at favorably when someone hears you're calling. So, but Secretary Prather, to his credit, was very adamant that we were going to clean it up and fix the structure and make sure that those things didn't happen. And so anything that I would recommend, he would, we accepted that and would kind of go forth over to General Assembly and make some of those things happen. Because at that point, you're taking money from quite a few people. One of the bigger things that happened when I was there was I raised the disadvantaged business goal from like 6% to 8%. So the world stopped. How dare I try to give minority, women, small businesses more transportation cabinet money, and make them use them and use my staff to go out and enforce those compliances for those on contractors. So, but we worked through it. Thankfully, the individuals from FHWA, from the Federal Highway Administration, were always really supportive of that. With that amount of money coming through the state, you have to make sure that that's done as reasonable as possible. So I also got to be there, and I'll add, part of the fallback from that and why there was such pushback was that was right after the stimulus money from President Obama at the time. So it was a lot of quote-unquote shovel-ready projects that I made sure that we had participation on and enforced that. That drive back and forth, I don't know how people do that many years. I could only do that for about 4, and decided I wanted to come back and work back in Louisville and not drive back and forth to Frankfurt. So at the time, Greg Fisher was running for mayor. He had known me from, you know, this water bottle. But I met him and said, I used to work at the city, worked there for a long time. I want to do HR because I talked to the HR director that was current at the time, and he told me he was retiring. So I was like, well, that's me. I can do this. Having only done HR for about 4 years at the time. But it helped that I knew the departments. I'd worked in the city for a long time prior to that. And so he was like, okay, what do you want to do? What is your vision for it? And I talked to him. And the thing about City Metro that I don't think a lot of people understand is it is 2/3 union and they're 1/3 non-union. But within those unions are 26 different collective bargaining agreements. And so, and then, you know, that would include FOP, IAFF for fire, carpenters, IBEW, Teamsters, ASME, firemen and oilers. So at any given point, you're negotiating or renegotiating about 8 or 9 contracts a year. And so I didn't know anything really about labor, but I said I did. And, but I did know a lot about HR, and so at that point I was able to come back and take over for the Human Resources Director at that time under Mayor Fisher. I said we negotiate quite a few contracts every year. At the time, we still had a lot of kind of like the situation we had now. They had made budget cuts in the time when I was gone, so they had furloughed employees that they weren't supposed to furlough. We had tons of grievances that we were looking at, and the mayor had a whole new vision around data and weakness orientation that we were all supposed to implement and go forth with and do. So we were still dealing with a lot of kind of mistrust from the HR department and Metro employees at that time. And just to give you perspective, the HR department at the city was about half my staff that I had at KYTC, even though we had the same number of employees and, of course, collective bargaining agreements to deal with. So it was, and it's been interesting working with HR. I always love it. Learning benefits and things of that nature and CNC structures and all that good stuff. But most of the time I spent a lot of my time negotiating and handling our collective bargaining agreements and dealing with the unions that we had at the time. About 4 years in, at the beginning of his next administration, he needed a general counsel. And because I had been in government once again for so long, I was like, I'll do it. You know, I can handle that. And it was, once again, a wonderful, good experience. As general counsel, of course, you advise the mayor, and structure within the county, in the city at the time, is the county attorney's office is actually the attorney for the mayor, for the electorate, and for the Metro Council. But the mayor is allowed to have one attorney. And so there are attorneys sprinkled throughout Metro government within departments, but when you're managing all of that, it is just a very interesting mix of things. So in addition to all the HR things and labor things that go through Metro government, I had boards and commissions pieces. I had, I was running a high bike and paddle and fell in that sidewalk piece, and now I'm suing the city. I had, all those type of cases in addition to any police misconduct, in addition to all of our other types of franchise negotiations and economic development deals. So at that point, everything that I had done kind of came to, well, I think I pulled on everything as general counsel with just the variety of work. In addition to that, like I said, I hadn't done bonds. I ended up doing bonds again. Hadn't done a lot of development agreements and negotiating those type of contracts in a while, but we worked on those. So I worked on and did the development deal for Omni, did for several renegotiations with Slugger Field, and also had the pleasure of learning telecommunications law and franchise law. So I also had to work on our agreements with LG&E for our franchise agreement with LG&E, as well as all the telecommunications stuff. So that meant I was negotiating with, I think it's Spectrum now. I did that twice because at one point they were merging with someone else and that fell through. And then I had to renegotiate that the second time when their merger actually did come through. Mayor Fisher has a very good vision for the city and a strong vision for the city, and so as you go through that and you're handling those negotiations, that also at that time involved broadband for us. So I got to work on everything Google Fiber up until the last, well, still do a little bit of it, because the nature of being at the city is some things that you do, you continue to do, and they stay with you till you leave. So because I now know telecommunications, aside from the county attorney's office, I still get all of the franchise agreements and small cell antenna agreements and all those other things until the next person can get up to speed and take that stuff from me. So never thought I would know about poles, One Touch Make Ready, fiber, and all things telecommunications, but now I do, and it was a really good experience learning how to do that, and now I work on our digital inclusion plan for the city. As we started working on things, because I have been with the city for over 20 years now, we began doing our journey, as I talked to him, I'd always been the affirmative action officer. Like, you come back, you get stuff you always used to have. So I still had that, plus all the other institutional knowledge that goes with that. And so we were working on some other things with a few other cities, and I was like, you know, we should have resources to make some of the departments and work on really working on ensuring that the things that we have within our affirmative action plan are going forward and not just brushing over it and talking. Not that we had any other issues more so than any other employer or anything of that nature, but we really hadn't done the focus and things that we needed to diversify some of the departments that needed that, to work on really changing the culture. And so we put together kind of like a cross-functional team of departments, and we're able to get a grant from the Government Alliance on Racial Equity. So that started maybe about 2.5 years ago, and once we got the grant, we were like, oh, okay, what are we gonna do? So talked a lot about it, and initially thought, as we worked through this cohort with the grant with about 5 other cities, that this was really going to be important work that we were going to do. As general counsel, I had begun to work with Josh Poe and Director of Human Relations Commission at the time. Her name was Carolyn Miller Cooper. She took my place when I left the Human Relations Commission. And Gina Dunlap, who was working at the time over the Office of Redevelopment Strategies. And that's how we came up with working with Josh, as they came to me at the end of their redlining study, because I was also the legislative liaison. So I hadn't talked a whole lot about that, but if the mayor had anything or any other department needed to talk to anybody in Metro Council, they had to go through me. And I sent information back and forth, attended all committee meetings, assigned people to committee meetings, gave all the information, reviewed everything that we did for them, and also wrote any of our resolutions and ordinances that we were sponsoring to go over there. And that's 26 different personalities. So those were a lot of long nights and busy days. But as we finished with the redlining study and going through the history of that, along with the other history of the city, as we wanted to put together and compile our equity story, I began to talk to some of the council members about what is redlining, what that was, how that looked like in Louisville, and then we came up with the map. And so that's how we also incorporated that into what we were doing at the very beginning. In meeting with other cities, we realized that all other cities, not all, but a few of them that were cohort had a person. They had a person that wasn't the HR director or wasn't the, because it's not just an HR problem, or someone that was working on purchasing. And so we put together a proposal to Mayor Fisher that we wanted a chief equity officer. And it took some convincing, not of him, but of Metro Council to fund the position. And initially, they only funded the position for 6 months. Like, they were like, no, y'all wait, this really ain't that big of a deal. Y'all should already be doing this. What do you mean we're not doing it? We're like, oh, we are, but what we're getting ready to do is really focus in on it. We are going to make it a priority and really change the way we are doing our work and use a equity lens on everything that we're doing. So that a good partner at the time was the Center for Health Equity, and we were able to get that through Metro Council. Then eventually it ended up, not long after that, it became me. I was appointed the same day as the Chief Resilience Officer, who's Eric Freelander. He and I work on all things together. So under my purview is HR and Human Relations Commission. But I also have to develop our racial equity plan. And I say racial equity and not just equity because it's very important in doing this work that you call out explicitly what we're doing and what we're working on. And yes, there are of course other protected classes and things that we need to focus on, but if you can fix race, if you focus in on race, which has a disparity in everything that you could possibly think of, housing, education, economic development, health, all those things, you will be fixing it for everyone else. And so as I go forward, I always say, yes, we are working on racial equity. Our plan is racial equity plan. and every other thing that we're working on. The training that we're doing is advancing racial equity within metro government. So one of the first things that we did at the time, as I start talking about some of the new initiatives and things that we're working on, is we developed what our vision statement is and our racial equity story, which of course, as I said before, is kind of going through the history of Louisville, including what you see with the redlining maps. If you haven't gone to redlininglouisville.org, you should take a look at that and see everything that we have on that story map. The story map starts back with the history of the timeline. Of course, we talk about Buchanan versus Worley. We go through slave trade all the way up until now with historic events on a timeline that mark Louisville's racial equity story, as we continue to call it. You can go on the map and see the 13 redline neighborhoods, and then we've taken that map and layered other recent data on top of that. Property, home ownership, economic status is on there, and some other recent data that we've done, and we've layered that on top of that. Unfortunately, what you will see is, aside from 2 neighborhoods, the 13 redline neighborhoods all look the same. Everything that was done under the comprehensive plan, by FHA at that time, we still are dealing with now, those same disparities, and that's why it's important that we call out racial equity. I know you probably heard I left my paper that had a lot of other statistics, but one of the most disturbing ones is that African Americans own $5.04 to every $100 that a white American has right now in wealth. That is sad. That is sad. Home ownership, for example, even if you take Louisville metro government at the Russell neighborhood, is less than 18%. And so those are the type of things that we are working on externally within metro government, is trying to build wealth, trying to make government the head of that as the convening power. Government, and I'm strongly believe this because of the structural and institutional racism that has built this country, has a responsibility to make sure that we are undoing that we are very intentional about removing barriers, that we are very intentional about new policy, that we are very intentional about new laws, and that we go about this in a way that will make sure that we are going to have opportunity for everyone despite where you live and your zip code. And so people are like, oh, government should be, no, we have a responsibility to do that. So I am, at this moment, very intentional about, as I said before, removing those barriers within what departments are doing in the everyday activity of what we do and how we do it. Whether it is giving permits, whether it's looking where development's going to go, whether it is picking up the trash and fixing broken streetlights. It all makes a difference. And so what we're doing now is really taking an equity lens to anything that will be changing within metro government. We have a racial equity toolkit that we use that I'm training metro employees on now, so that if they look to make any changes or revise any policies or put those things forward, we are going through the racial equity toolkit, which I say is a product and a process, because you're going through these things in a series of questions. You're also engaging stakeholders, which is really most important, and not engaging them in a way that says, I am planning and zoning and I'm having a meeting and this new development is coming into your neighborhood, so y'all come to me. No, we are going to start going to them. We need to go to the stakeholders and really getting their voice in what they want to see happen within their neighborhood and their surrounding area. We can't just say, we're doing this for you because we think this is what you like, and come to our meeting so we can tell you what we're getting ready to do. That should not be the way we should continue to do business. Under an equity lens, you are hearing the voice from the community and you're fully engaging them within that, in addition to looking at the data, in addition to looking at the consequences that could come for whatever you are trying to propose, the unintended consequences, and you try to mitigate that. In some cases, we might not be doing it, we might continue to do it knowing that we're going to have some disparity, but we're also going to talk about how we plan to mitigate that. A lot of what we've done over the last year and a half is stop things that people didn't even know was going to happen. So that is, to me, success. If someone is coming from a department and they're saying, hey, we need to use the racial equity toolkit and take a look at this, then amen, yes, we will. I'm glad someone has come up with that. Structurally, what I have put in place within Metro government is every department has a racial equity liaison. I meet with that person and that group of people once a month. In addition, I still have a cross-functional team of individuals from all the departments that worked on when we first had the grant from GARE. And we work across departments at huger, bigger issues, such as some of the things we're doing in HR, such as the contracting and procurement, and then also a piece that we're doing with youth. Part of what we're doing is making sure that everyone is trained. Everyone, all employees are mandated to have racial equity training. Not just implicit bias, which is a part of it, but it's racial equity training. And we now have that brought in so that our new hires are now brought into that and oriented in that as well. You cannot serve on a hiring interview panel unless you've had this training as well. Therefore, what we're also doing furthermore is looking at applications, looking at job classifications. We had been looking at any type of salary and compression issues for all things that would be unequal in that. We just ran into a big bubble with that, as y'all can heard with what we're doing with budget. But we're still gonna push through and continue the review of that as we go forward. Other bigger projects and things that we've been working on is we've changed the way that we do some of the hiring. We pay in the box. We don't ask those questions. We work on other reentry programs and working with other employers in doing that as well. And so it's a journey, as I always tell people. There's a continuum of where we are. We're still at the beginning. We're not where we were. We recognize we have problems and weaknesses, and we are going to continue to work on those as we go forward.
Just for the sake of time, I want to open the floor for questions. I have a really quick question, and then whoever's next. You mentioned that you look through everything through an equity lens. I guess maybe they're part of the toolkit, in addition to looking at the data and mitigating unintended consequences. For an organization like a higher ed organization that's kind of small, like a law school, based on your expertise, how would you recommend we address climate issues here or try to change the culture to being more inclusive outside of mitigating unintended consequences and training?
Yeah, and you have to go further than compliance would be where I would always start. So you definitely have to look at your data, whether in faculty-wise, staff-wise, and student-wise, look at that. The other thing that I did within Metro government from our employees is I did a survey, and I'm sure y'all probably look at that, just to get everyone's opinion on where they think we are. Other things that I'm doing to try to help us work through that, of course, is with training. We start there, and I'm working to build our training curriculum, particularly for mid-level managers, and starting there smack in the middle, because that's usually where the rubber will hit the road. I can say all kinds of things from the mayor's office and be like, do this, do this, do this, and operationally, if they don't do it or can't do it or won't do it, then that's where we're going to have a problem. I can send people back to training. One of the things that we do at the end of every training is we ask someone personally while they're there, look at what you do every day. What are you going to do differently in the way you think about your job after having been through this training? We collect all those and have those incorporated into department strategic plans. As we work through them, every department has their strategic plan. Part of that is working toward equity goals. I measure things now. Everyone knows what gets measured is what people pay attention to. So if you're not meeting our goal of 15% minority participation in contracting in your spend, then you gotta tell me why. If you didn't use a certified vendor and I have 5 on my list, I need to know why. If you didn't put that back out for bid and you're just using the same people, we're gonna talk about it. If we're sending you people through HR that are diverse candidates, then you need to interview them. Particularly if you are underutilized in some areas, and I have documented that. We are going to measure that. We measure that through our STAT program. The other thing that we're starting to do, which a lot of other large employers do, is they have affinity or employee resource groups. Everyone at Metro is like, oh, we've got that, we got unions. Well, that's not the same thing. We need to have people come together within their affinity group and really help us change the culture of what we're doing. So we'll be starting that at the beginning of the new fiscal year.
So in addition to the accountability, because I think one of the issues that we have is that what people perceive, no consequences for bad behavior. But I wanted to switch just a little bit before people leave, and if you could just talk a little bit about Lean in Louisville and how we could participate with the city in Lean In.
Lean into Louisville is a new citywide initiative that the mayor and I just announced at the beginning of this year. And where that came from was out of all the actions and things that we saw out of Charlottesville. And at the same time, if you remember here, we had the first vandalism of what was the Castleman statue. So out of that, we decided to pull people together and really figure out what we wanted to do around equity, discrimination, and prejudice. And so what Lean into Louisville does is it provides educational opportunities, learning opportunities on all forms of discrimination, race, gender,